In this lecture, we will be examining the history of the Knights of Labor, one of the most influential labor unions of the Gilded Age. The official name of the union was the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor. At its peak in the late 1880s, the union boasted over 800,000 members. This graph, in terms of background, shows the changes in the American workforce in the period from 1870 to 1910. The percentage of Americans employed in agriculture fell from approximately 50% of the American workforce in 1870 to just over 30% in 1910. At the same time, the manufacturing and construction sectors grew significantly, and this growth in these labor-intensive fields contributed to the rise in power of the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor was founded in 1869 by garment cutters in Philadelphia. The group emerged on the national scene after the 1873 collapse of another rival union known as the National Labor Union. Initially, the Knights of Labor was more like a fraternal organization than a true labor union, but by 1882, the Knights of Labor had completely moved away from the fraternal origins of the group. This was in part to calm fears that the group had ties to Freemasonry with its elaborate rituals and secret codes. This was an industrial union, not a trade-specific union, and it sought to appeal to a broad range of workers in many industries. The Knights of Labor was envisioned as a national union that organized all workers, whether skilled or unskilled, into a single powerful union that would advocate for legislation to protect workers' rights, and a group that would bring about social, political, and economic reform. For its time, the union was very inclusive, accepting unskilled workers, women, and African Americans in its ranks. The Knights of Labor, however, was somewhat exclusive, and it did not permit people working as bankers, lawyers, or liquor dealers to join. The Knights of Labor also barred Chinese workers from joining. In some ways, you could say that the Knights of Labor embodied a form of the political philosophy that we would today call producerism, or the idea that American society is somewhat corrupted by so-called parasitic elements at the top and bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. The union was as distrustful of large corporations as it was of radical political groups like communists and anarchists who purported to speak for the working class and the poor. The most famous leader of the Knights of Labor was Terence V. Powderly, pictured here, who served as the Grand Master Workman from 1879 to 1893. Powderly got his start as a railroad switchman, spent several years as an apprentice machinist. He became a member of the International Union of Machinists and Blacksmiths in 1871, and eventually rose to the position of local union president. His union activities and the Depression of 1873 found Powderly out of work. He was also blacklisted as a union agitator and found it even more difficult to work. He joined the Knights of Labor in 1876 and rapidly rose to a position of prominence in the union. On a side note, if you are a fan of the U.S. version of the television show The Office, you'll be interested to know that Powderly's home, shown here in Scranton, Pennsylvania, is still standing. If you look closely, you won't see Dwight Schrute there. Historian Leon Fink, who you are familiar with from our readings in the Major Problems text, argued that the Republican political tradition formed what he called vital center of 19th century American political culture in his labor history book entitled Working Man's Democracy. However, after the Civil War, a growing number of Americans had become disenchanted with classical liberal politics. The Knights of Labor thus challenged that cultural hegemony of liberalism with a somewhat radical cultural alternative. Fink wrote that engagement and even partial assimilation of the dominant culture by an opposition movement might be a sign of political strength rather than weakness. However, I'm going to add that an important part of the reason for the group's appeal, simply put, was that it allowed a wide variety of workers to join a union who were not welcome in other trade-based unions, even setting aside race and gender exclusions often practiced by other unions. The Knights of Labor did not have the sort of trade-specific prohibitions like most unions that emerged in specific trades. The Knights of Labor also tended to prefer mediation over direct actions such as strikes, and this probably appealed to members who were fearful of a lengthy or costly period out of work. I like to divide the goals of the Knights of Labor, the various goals, into two distinct categories in terms of pragmatic goals and idealistic goals. For pragmatic goals, the Knights of Labor was interested in attaining things like the 8-hour workday, end to child labor. They were interested in equal pay for equal work. As I mentioned, they preferred arbitration rather than strikes. They sought to promote cooperative business arrangements where everyone would benefit. They were also interested, if you think back to our earlier lectures, in currency reform. So they shared that with the agrarian movement and the populists. In terms of idealistic goals, or perhaps unattainable ones, they wrote of something that they called the cooperative commonwealth. So producers would benefit, parasites would not, and they saw parasites being in several guises: lawyers, stockbrokers, liquor dealers, gamblers, people who sort of siphoned off the wealth of the working class. They wanted to get a greater respect for the nation's producers, so factory workers and farmers, and diminished authority for, again, what they called the nation's parasites, so owners of capital and other non-productive members of society, or at least non-productive in their view. These would be the more idealistic goals. The union's growth skyrocketed in the middle of the decade of the 1880s, and it grew by 500,000 workers in the years 1885 and 1886. Just explosive growth. The 1886 Haymarket Affair, which you'll be watching a video of this week, was unfortunately a turning point and sort of a bellwether of the movement's decline. The violence in Chicago that year was not caused by the Knights of Labor or its leaders, but unfortunately many newspapers made subtle and not so subtle efforts to implicate the Knights of Labor. Two of the indicted defendants in the rioting were members of the Knights of Labor, but the actions of the alleged anarchist bombers were not sanctioned in any way by the Knights of Labor. This is a case of guilt by association, and unfortunately the Knights of Labor was equated with supporting violent anarchism, at least in the eyes of many Americans, influenced by the media of the day. By 1890, factionalism within the Knights of Labor and poor leadership, along with some significant employer repression, effectively destroyed the Knights of Labor movement. By 1900, the group had largely ceased to exist as any kind of meaningful movement. Most members joined either the AFL, the more conservative-leaning AFL, or the more radical IWW, though few small local organizations kept the Knights of Labor name into the middle of the 20th century. If you look on the internet today, you can still find a few groups that claim to be the heirs of the legacy of the Knights of Labor. I don't know how really active they are. One group claiming to be the true Knights of Labor actually sued another group using the name in the early 2000s. The Knights of Labor, as we indicated, was rather forward-looking or progressive for its time, or at least more inclusive. They had a slogan that encapsulated the group's racial inclusiveness. An injury to one is the concern of all. While the group did take the groundbreaking stand of accepting African American members after 1878, It also tolerated branches of the Knights of Labor in the South that practiced racial segregation. In addition, the Knights put significant support behind the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, as well as the Contract Labor Law of 1885. Both pieces of legislation were designed to deter Chinese immigrants traveling to the United States for work. This is a newspaper clipping from 1883 that illustrates the cultural effects of the racial policies of the Knights of Labor in some areas of the United States, especially the South. This quote in particular by an unnamed author is interesting. Many Southerners are losing considerable sleep just at this time, worrying over the organization of Knights of Labor assemblies among their colored employees. The implication here is that the enormous amount of money at the hands of these Northerners, these Knights of Labor assemblies, would disrupt Southern life. And this draws to a close our brief look at the Knights of Labor.